Hi, I'm Vanessa. They always said I was the strong one, the quiet one, the one who didn't need anything. And maybe that's why they thought they could take everything without asking. My med school fund, given to my sister, my research, claimed in her name, even the house I grew up in, lost behind my back until I bought it without telling them. Then one night, at dinner, Claire smirked and said, "Remember when they picked my college over your med school?" Dad raised his glass and smiled. Good thing we bet on Claire. So I opened the envelope and watched their world flip in silence. But how did it get to this point? And how many times can one family erase you before you finally stop disappearing? Let me tell you, I could feel the tension the moment I stepped onto the porch of my childhood home. The paint on the front door was flaking, the welcome mat was frayed, and the porch light flickered like a dying firefly. Des Moines evenings in early October had that kind of chill that slipped beneath your coat, quiet, but insistent. And as I reached for the doorknob, I knew this dinner wasn't going to be just about pot roast and small talk. Inside, the smell of overcooked onions clung to the air like regret. The dining room looked the same as it did when I was 16, except older, more tired. Wallpaper yellowed at the edges, a framed cross-stitch reading "Family First" hung crooked on the wall, and the once proud china cabinet now had a noticeable lean. Claire's voice echoed from the kitchen, overly loud, theatrical. "It's from the article in Des Moines Monthly. They wanted a shot of me by the courthouse steps, but I said no. I wanted something more personal." I followed the sound, spotting her in her full performative glow. She held a wine glass like a prop, gesturing dramatically as Mom beamed at her. Dad stood by the counter with his arms crossed, nodding like her manager. Then there was me, standing in the doorway like a guest in my own home. On the refrigerator, I saw the cover of the magazine Claire was talking about. Her photo stared back, bright smile, stiff shoulders, arms crossed with fake confidence. The caption read, "Clare Brenton, the legal mind of the Midwest." I almost laughed. Claire hadn't won a case worth mentioning in years, but she sure knew how to market herself. "Vanessa, honey," Mom called out, finally noticing me. "You made it just in time." Claire turned with a half smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We were just talking about the article. Did you see it yet?" I glanced at it. I replied evenly. Dad cleared his throat. "You know, not every day one of our own gets featured like that. It's quite a thing." "Yeah," I said, walking toward the dining table. "It's something." Dinner was already plated. Mom had pulled out the special occasion dishes, floral edges, slightly chipped, just like always. She served Claire first. I seated myself at the far end of the table, across from the sideboard where a stack of unopened bills teetered beside a bowl of dusty mints. For the first few minutes, I let them talk. Claire relayed a story about a difficult client who didn't understand legal jargon. Dad chuckled like it was the funniest thing he'd heard all year. Mom kept offering Claire more potatoes. Then came the moment that split the air. Claire took a sip of her wine, leaned back, and with a grin that had razors behind it, said, "Remember when they picked my college over your med school, Ness?" The table paused. My name hadn't even been in the air for 5 minutes before she stabbed it. Dad laughed, not even looking at me. "Good thing we bet on Claire." Mom chuckled too, eyes flicking toward me, not a trace of apology in them. I sat there, watching their faces, their cheerfulness so sharp it sliced through years of quiet hurt. And then, I smiled, just slightly. I reached down, pulled my bag from the side of the chair, and placed a thick manila envelope on the table. "I've been meaning to bring this," I said, my tone steady. Claire looked at it like it was a snake coiled and ready to strike. "What is that?" I slid it toward Dad. "The deed." He blinked. "To what?" "To this house," I said plainly. "You refinanced it 3 times to pay for Claire's law school, her condo, and her networking trips. You defaulted. The bank put it up for foreclosure 3 months ago. I bought it." Silence. Claire's fork froze halfway to her mouth. Mom's face turned the color of chalk. Dad opened the envelope with shaking fingers, scanning the documents. His lips moved, forming words silently. "You're joking," Claire muttered. "That's not possible." "It's legal. It's done," I said. You bought the house? Mom asked, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. I didn't want you to lose it, but I also couldn't let this keep happening. Dad leaned back, stunned. We didn't even know. I know, I interrupted. That's the problem. Nobody touched their food after that. The table that used to echo with praise for Claire had gone stone cold. And as they sat there, my parents stunned, Claire fuming behind her wine glass, I didn't gloat. I didn't smirk. I just let the silence expand. In that silence, I finally became louder than all of them. I wasn't their afterthought anymore. I wasn't the backup plan. I was the one who saved them, and didn't ask to be thanked. But even as I stared at their shocked faces, I remembered the moment I first knew I was never the one they bet on. I was 17, trembling with hope, holding my med school acceptance letter in both hands. I had worked 2 jobs, tutored younger students, volunteered at the hospital every weekend. I earned that letter. I couldn't wait to show them. Dad barely glanced at it. That's not realistic, Vanessa. Med school's expensive, and we've already started paying for Claire's tuition. Mom added gently, You're strong, honey, Claire. Claire needs the support more. And just like that, my dreams shriveled in their kitchen light. I took that letter upstairs, folded it neatly, and placed it in the back of my desk drawer. I never brought it up again. They never asked. But tonight, they would remember. Not because I said it louder, but because I finally said it with proof. With a pen. With a purchase. With power. As we walked to the car that night, the cool air clung to my skin. I didn't speak, didn't cry, didn't even look back at the porch where my parents still stood, the envelope in Dad's hand like a grenade that had already gone off. Sorrel was quiet beside me. She didn't offer platitudes. She knew I didn't want comfort. I wanted silence, the kind that meant power had shifted, not evaporated. Driving home through dimly lit streets, my mind didn't stay in the present. It drifted backward, the way old wounds do when poked just right. Not to last year, not to med school rejections or missed opportunities. It went all the way back to 3rd grade, to cardboard planets and a pine-scented school gym. The science fair had been my first real win. I'd built a model of the solar system, each planet painted by hand, strung from a hanger frame that actually rotated using a tiny motor I salvaged from a broken toy. I still remember how my teacher's eyes widened when the lights dimmed and the planets began to spin, each one glowing from the battery-powered bulbs I'd wired. She said it was beyond grade level, said I had a mind meant for more. I held the blue ribbon so tightly my fingers ached. I couldn't wait to get home. But when I burst through the door, full of pride and clumsy excitement, the living room was already full. Of Claire's drama club friends, of branches and glitter and a papier-mâché tree trunk. She got cast as tree number 2, my mom exclaimed, like Claire had landed a lead role on Broadway. Dad was hot gluing moss onto cardboard. I stood there, ribbon dangling from my wrist, waiting. I waited through the pizza order, through the phone calls to relatives being invited to the big performance. No one asked about my ribbon. No one looked at my model. Eventually, I carried it upstairs and placed it on my dresser. The tiny orbits kept spinning long after I'd crawled into bed. I left them on through the night. It was the only light in the room. That was the first time I realized I could be extraordinary and still invisible. Years later, in college, I tried again. I didn't just want to be seen. I wanted to matter. I poured myself into a research paper on early markers of neurodegenerative diseases. I spent nights in the library, scouring case studies, compiling data. When I got a call from the med school program head saying my preliminary work was promising, I allowed myself a sliver of hope. Claire, by then, was between majors again. One night, she visited campus, claiming she needed to study somewhere that wasn't loud. I let her crash on my futon. I was halfway through my draft, scattered pages everywhere. "This is heavy stuff," she said, flipping through one of my printouts. "It's for a neuro pre-med grant," I told her. "You wouldn't be interested." She smirked. "Who says I'm not?" I should have known then. 3 months later, she emailed me a copy of an article from a regional law school publication. "Guess who got a scholarship essay published?" it read. I clicked the link, expecting something about civil liberties or nonprofit work. Instead, I saw my words, rephrased, rearranged, but undeniably mine. She'd borrowed the structure, lifted my metaphors, and even recycled a story about volunteering in a memory care ward, something she had never done. When I confronted her, her response was so casual, it knocked the breath out of me. "Oh, come on, Ness. We're family. It's all shared, right?" I wish I could say I yelled, that I threw something, that I made a scene, but I didn't. I froze, like I always had. And in that pause, Claire claimed another spotlight with my name still echoing in the dark behind her. Back in the present, the memory made me nauseous. I turned away from the window and looked at my reflection in the kitchen glass. Not much had changed. Same careful eyes, same quiet mouth, but something inside was different. Not rage, no, something colder, something clearer. Sorrel set a mug of tea in front of me. She didn't ask what I was thinking. She just said, "You don't have to carry their silence anymore." I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I was already setting it down. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I walked into the spare room we turned into an office and opened the drawer I hadn't touched in years. Inside were all the things I had once put away. The blue ribbon, now faded at the edges, a copy of my med school acceptance letter, a printed version of the neuroscience draft, untouched, unsubmitted, still mine. I laid them out on the desk, side by side. These weren't trophies. They were receipts. I didn't need revenge. I didn't want war, but I would not be erased again. The next morning, I received a text from my mother. No apology, just, "Claire's upset. You embarrassed her. This is not how family behaves." I stared at the screen for a long while before typing a reply. Then maybe we're not the kind of family I thought we were. I didn't hit send, not yet. I went outside instead. The morning air still held traces of last night's chill, but the sun had begun to push its way through. Sorrel stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching the street like something might change. She looked at me and asked gently, "Are you okay?" I considered lying, but I was done doing that. "No, but I will be." Inside the house, the silence had changed. It wasn't about being shut out anymore. It was the sound of boundaries finally being drawn. I spent most of that night staring at the folder on my desk, the one I'd finally labeled with the truth. The documents inside weren't trophies or weapons. They were pieces of myself I had tucked away for years, waiting for someone, anyone, to notice. They never did. But now I wasn't waiting for them. I was keeping score, not to hurt anyone, but to finally protect the girl who had stayed silent too long. The next morning was foggy and cold. I remember because I had to scrape ice off my windshield, and in doing so, I caught my reflection in the window. I looked, not angry, exactly, more like a storm that had stopped asking for permission. Work passed in a blur. The clinic was understaffed as usual, and I buried myself in back-to-back patient charts until it was past 6 and the hallway lights dimmed. As I packed my things, a notification blinked across my phone. Dad's name, a group text. I hesitated before opening it. "Dinner at our place next Friday," it read. "Celebrating Claire's help with my hospital stay. Her support got me through." I stood in the middle of the hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and read it again. My grip on the phone tightened. Claire's help? I was the one who had left work early, who'd sat in the ER for hours, filled out the paperwork, handed over my debit card without a word. I didn't respond. I didn't even forward the text to Sorrel, which I usually did when I needed her to talk me down. By the time I pulled into our driveway, I had replayed that week in my head a dozen times. The hospital, Dad groggy and confused, Mom flustered, Claire conveniently out of town for a networking event. I'd canceled 3 meetings. I'd stayed through the night. But Claire had shown up 2 days later with a tray of muffins and posted a photo on social media with the caption, "Family means showing up, even when it's hard." The comments section read like a Hallmark card. "You're such a blessing, Claire. He's lucky to have you. God knew what he was doing when he made you sisters." No one ever asked where I was. That weekend, I found myself back at the house, Mom's 60th birthday. It was the kind of celebration she always dreamed of. Lace tablecloths, wine glasses she'd been saving for the right occasion, candles that smelled like vanilla, and a Pinterest board. I had spent months restoring the necklace from her mother's wedding, an old heirloom that had sat in a dusty box under her bed since the late 90s. I found a jeweler, paid for the delicate work myself, and even got the clasp re-engraved with her initials. I wrapped it in soft velvet, placed it inside a polished wooden box, and wrote a handwritten note tucked beneath the lid. She opened it during dessert, in front of everyone. Her hands trembled just slightly when she held it up. "Claire, you always know just what I like," she said, eyes glistening. I blinked. Laughter bubbled at the table. Claire leaned over, gave Mom a peck on the cheek, and whispered, "You deserve the best, Mama." The box was still in front of me. The note was still inside. I looked at Sorrel, who sat across from me. She knew. Her face didn't change, but her eyes flicked to the necklace, then to Claire, then back to me. I smiled politely and drank the rest of my wine in one long pull. On Monday, a photo of Mom wearing the necklace showed up online with the caption, "A gift from Claire. She knows my heart." The comments were, again, exactly what you'd expect. "That girl never misses. She gets it from her mama." Claire has always been the thoughtful one. I didn't correct it. Neither did Claire. That night, as I folded laundry and watched Sorrel silently stack dishes in the kitchen, I said aloud for the first time, "I think I've been trained to stay quiet." She didn't stop what she was doing. "Trained by who?" "My family," I said. "By the way they reward silence. By how every time I've spoken up, they've made me feel like I'm being dramatic, like I'm jealous." She dried her hands and turned to face me. "You think staying quiet makes you graceful?" I used to. I used to think it made me mature, like I was above it." Sorrel crossed the room and sat beside me. "Grace is strength, sure, but letting yourself disappear isn't noble, Vanessa." "It's tragic." I didn't reply. I just nodded, eyes fixed on a spot on the floor. The following weekend, while cleaning out the storage closet, I found more. Old journals, receipts, photos, snapshots of the life I lived in the margins. An envelope with a check stub from the time I paid Claire's rent during her so-called internship in Chicago. A thank you card, unsigned. A copy of the first draft of my med school personal statement. A note Claire had scribbled in the margin. "This is actually good. Mind if I use parts of it?" I never said no. I laid everything out on the dining table, not with a sense of revenge, but of clarity. It was a puzzle I had finally finished. The pieces all fit. I pulled a folder from the cabinet, slid everything inside, and sealed it. Then, I took a Sharpie and wrote across the front in bold capital letters. "When they rewrite me, I'll hand them the truth." I meant what I wrote on that folder. I didn't say it out of spite or bitterness. It was simply the truth. But I knew better than to believe the truth alone could survive in my family. Not without proof, and certainly not without a voice. Mine. 2 weeks after organizing that folder, I was invited to speak at a fundraiser in downtown Des Moines. It was a health equity gala, filled with local leaders, hospital board members, nonprofit executives, the kind of crowd that smiled politely but rarely looked you in the eye unless your last name meant something. My invitation came through a colleague at the clinic. She had nominated me after reading a paper I'd published on rural care gaps. It wasn't flashy, but it was real, data-backed, personal, rooted in years of quiet service. I agreed to speak, not to prove anything, but because I believed the work mattered. Sorrel helped me prep the speech the night before. We sat in our living room, sipping tea, revising the final paragraph. "Leave them with something sharp," she said. "But not cruel." I nodded. "I'm not trying to cut, just clarify." The next evening, I arrived early. The ballroom was warm, decorated in soft gold lighting and towering floral centerpieces that smelled like they cost more than my car's monthly insurance. I wore a navy dress, professional but simple. No one greeted me at the door, but I'd expected that. An hour in, after a few rounds of speeches, the MC stepped up and cleared his throat into the microphone. "Our next speaker is a woman many of you already know, a leader in advocacy, a voice for underserved communities. Please welcome Dr. Clare Brenton. I blinked. There was a beat of confusion in the room, a couple of sideways glances, then applause. Claire stood up from a table near the front, smoothing her dress as she walked to the stage. My prepared speech was in her hands. I recognized the font. I recognized the edits I'd made the night before. She launched into it with ease, her cadence slower, more theatrical than mine. She paused in places I hadn't written pauses. She added little anecdotes that didn't belong to her. At one point, she said, "When I first volunteered at the clinic on the East Side, I saw firsthand how poverty intersects with access." Claire had never set foot in that clinic, not once. The applause when she finished was louder than it had been all night. I clapped, too, slowly, not out of support, but out of necessity. I knew if I didn't, someone would notice. When the crowd dispersed for coffee and dessert, I made my way to the hallway outside the ballroom, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river. She joined me a few minutes later, all smiles. "Well?" she asked. "What'd you think?" "That was my speech." She shrugged. "It was your idea, but my delivery. You get how this works." "You stole my words." "We're sisters, Ness. Come on, isn't everything shared?" I stared at her, realizing there was no shame, no flicker of guilt, only entitlement. "One day," I said, voice low and even, "people will know the difference." She scoffed. "By then, it won't matter." I walked away without another word. Later that week, I attended an alumni event at my undergrad alma mater. I had been chosen for a medical leadership award. Nothing national, just a quiet acknowledgement of service, the kind that happens when you're not trying to be seen. The auditorium was modest, filled with familiar faces from old biology labs and TA-led lectures. When my name was called, I stepped onto the stage to a kind, warm applause. I scanned the crowd and saw my mother beaming in the third row. The faculty lead handed me the plaque, then turned to the microphone and said, "We're joined tonight by Vanessa's family. Elaine, would you like to say a few words?" My mother stood, took the mic, and smiled. "We are just so proud of our daughter, Claire. She's always had the heart of a leader." There it was again. I didn't flinch. I didn't correct her. The audience gave another round of applause, assuming perhaps I went by my middle name. Or maybe they thought we were twins. It didn't matter. I took the mic next, smiled gently, and said, "Thank you for this recognition. It means more than you know." Afterward, in the hallway, my mom hugged me tight. "It was a slip of the tongue," she whispered. "You know what I meant." "Do I?" That night, back at home, Sorrel sat with me on the couch while I watched footage from both events. Her fingers traced slow circles on my shoulder as I played Claire's speech again. "You going to let them keep doing this?" she asked softly. I muted the video. "They've taken my words, my work, my name." So? "So no," I said. "Next time they speak for me, I'll answer." And I meant it, not as a threat, but as a promise to myself. I wasn't going to shout or argue. I wasn't going to post anything online or send dramatic emails. I was simply going to be undeniable. The drive home from the alumni ceremony had been quiet, not heavy, but thoughtful. I remember glancing at Sorrel as she drove, her hand resting gently on the gear shift, her eyes watching the road but occasionally flicking my way, checking. I hadn't said much since I told her, "Next time they speak for me, I'll answer." I meant it, but I also knew silence, when it's lasted long enough, doesn't just break, it has to be unlearned. A few days later, just after lunch at the clinic, I sat in my office sorting through billing files when my phone buzzed with a notification. It was from the bank. A withdrawal of $4,500 had been made from an old joint account I had with my mother. That account had been created when I was in college, technically hers, but used for emergencies when I was putting myself through undergrad and couldn't always afford groceries or car repairs. It was barely touched in the last few years. We had agreed, mutually, that it would stay untouched unless it was absolutely necessary. There had been no emergency. I logged into the account, heart thudding low in my chest. The funds had gone to a credit agency, a payment on a maxed-out card, Claire's card. I didn't react right away. I just sat there, blinking at the screen, the buzz of the fluorescent lights over my head suddenly sharp. I waited until the clinic closed, then drove straight to my parents' house. I didn't call first. I didn't knock when I got there. I walked in like I used to, back when things hadn't felt so transactional. Mom was in the kitchen, stirring something in a pot. The scent of beef stew filled the air. She looked up and smiled. "Hey, sweetie, I was just thinking of calling you." I leaned against the counter. "We need to talk about the account." She didn't pretend not to know what I meant. She didn't even blink. Claire needed help. It was a temporary thing. I stared at her. "Without asking me?" "You weren't using it," she said simply. "It's not like you'd miss it. It wasn't yours to touch." She set the spoon down, her voice softening in that way she always used when trying to end a conversation without resolution. "She's your sister. She's going through a lot right now." "And I'm not? You've always been the strong one." There it was, that line. The justification they used like a get-out-of-jail-free card. I pushed away from the counter and walked out before I said something I'd regret. I didn't go home right away. I drove to the park near our apartment, the one with the little wooden benches facing the lake. It was dusk by the time I sat down, and the air had cooled. I pulled out my phone, logged into my bank, and transferred every remaining dollar out of the joint account. Then I made a call to close it entirely. That weekend, I started pulling my name off anything even remotely tied to the family estate. I thought that would be the end of it, until I received a letter from the city housing office 2 weeks later. It was addressed to me, but the content didn't make sense. "Congratulations," it read. "Your low-income rent deduction has been approved." I didn't apply for that. The letter included a breakdown, proof of residence at my address, Claire's name as the applicant. Somehow, she had used my home address, my personal, private residence, to claim she lived there, qualifying her for a program she didn't meet the criteria for. I was stunned. This went beyond selfishness. It was illegal, and it put my own tax records at risk. Sorrel found me standing in the kitchen, holding the letter with shaking hands. I handed it to her without a word. She read it, her face growing still. "She used your address?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "She didn't even tell me. She just assumed you'd stay silent." Not this time. The next morning, I called my mother. "Not Claire. Not yet." She answered on the second ring, cheery as if nothing were wrong. "Vanessa, hi!" I cut her off. "I received a letter from the city. Claire used my address to apply for housing assistance. She committed fraud, and unless she fixes it, I'm filing a report." There was a pause. "Vanessa, you can't be serious." "I'm completely serious. She didn't mean any harm. It was probably just a mix-up." "It wasn't. She listed my apartment, forged documentation, and now my own taxes might be flagged. I'm not covering for her again." Mom sighed, that long, exaggerated sigh that said she was exhausted by my dramatics. "You always take things too far. She's your sister. And that's not an excuse anymore. You're threatening your own family." "No," I said, voice steady, colder than I expected. "I've just finally learned that silence has a cost." And I hung up. The following day, I opened a separate account in a different bank under my name only. I updated my payroll, my medical licenses, every point of contact that had once listed my parents' house as a backup. I submitted a preliminary inquiry to the city's fraud division. I didn't name Claire yet, but I documented everything. I even printed the forms, sealed them in a folder, wrote the same sentence on the front in black ink. When they rewrite me, I'll hand them the truth. Because this wasn't just about money or addresses or even legal risk. This was about survival. They could ignore the warnings, but they'd soon learn that quiet doesn't mean weak, and my silence was no longer their ally. It was a Friday evening when I found myself sitting alone at the dining table, staring down at a stack of old manila folders. Sorrel had gone out to grab groceries before the storm that was supposed to roll through overnight. The house was quiet, except for the ticking wall clock and the soft hum of the dishwasher. The words I'd said earlier that week kept circling my thoughts like persistent static. I'm ready to stop letting them break me. I meant it. But meaning something and acting on it were two different things. That's what I was coming to understand. You don't rebuild yourself with declarations. You do it in paperwork, bank authorizations, notarized statements, cold, boring things. But that's how power shifts, through signatures, not screaming. My phone buzzed again, another bank alert. I silenced it without checking. I already knew what it was. Overdraft protection triggered because of another accidental family withdrawal. I'd taken steps, sure, but the past had a habit of reaching forward, clawing at anything that wasn't nailed down. I stood up and walked toward the back room, the one Sorrel and I used for storage. Boxes lined the walls, each one labeled in my tidy print. But one box near the back wasn't like the others. Its tape had been peeled off and loosely resealed, as if someone had rummaged through it without care. I pulled it out, dragged it to the center of the floor, and opened the lid. Inside were pieces of my childhood. Old school awards, cards from teachers, hand-drawn pictures with glitter still flaking off the edges. A crumpled letter from a summer science program I was accepted to, but never attended, because Claire had a dance recital the same weekend and we could only do so much. At the very bottom, I found a college composition notebook, its edges worn, pages stained with age. Flipping it open, I landed on a single entry from my sophomore year. The handwriting was mine, rushed, slanted. Claire got caught cheating. Again. She was in full panic. Dad said it could cost her the scholarship. Mom cried. I rewrote the paper overnight, used a sample I'd started for my own ethics course. No one thanked me. This morning, Claire smiled and told me, "You're such a lifesaver." I closed the notebook, hands shaking, not with anger, but something colder. Resentment aged into resolve, the kind of quiet that no longer flinched. That memory still stung, not because of what I did, but because of what it cost me. It wasn't just a paper. It was a piece of myself I handed over without hesitation, because somewhere along the line, I had been trained to believe Claire's success was more important than my own. The following morning, Sorrel and I drove over to my parents' place. Dad hadn't been well lately. He was losing weight, forgetting things. I hadn't wanted to cut him off from visits. Not yet. Mom greeted us at the door with her usual rehearsed warmth, all sugary concern and overly bright eyes. "You're early," she said, stepping aside to let us in. "Claire's upstairs finishing a call. She's launching a new mentorship thing, some online platform for women in law." I nodded, taking in the familiar smells of furniture polish and coffee. Nothing ever changed in this house, and yet it felt like everything had eroded. "I just want to check on Dad," I said. "He's resting," she replied. "But go ahead." I walked up the stairs, passing the framed photos lining the walls. Every one of them had Claire front and center: homecoming court, graduation, the internship at that DC law office she didn't last 3 months in. When I opened the door to what used to be my old bedroom, I froze. It wasn't a bedroom anymore. It was a studio. Cameras mounted to ring lights. A green screen pinned across one wall. Shelves lined with books I knew she hadn't read. And in the corner, a pile of discarded boxes, my boxes. I walked over, sifting through them. Some were open. One had been torn. My journals, trophies, letters, all dumped into a trash bag like leftovers. I didn't say a word. I just picked up the bag, slung it over my shoulder, and walked back downstairs. Claire was in the living room by then, sipping coffee with one leg crossed over the other like a lifestyle blogger. When she saw the bag, her expression didn't change. "That stuff?" she said casually. "You don't live here. Why keep things that don't matter?" I didn't respond. I just looked her dead in the eye, turned, and walked out the front door. Back at home, I emptied the trash bag onto our living room floor. Sorrel helped me sort through it. Some of the pages were bent, others stained. A few were salvageable. "You okay?" she asked softly. "No," I answered. "But I'm done letting them decide what matters." That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the storm roll in. Around 3 a.m., I got up, made a cup of tea, and sat down at my computer. I opened a file I'd been too afraid to act on for weeks, one I'd created after learning about the house's foreclosure status. The paperwork was already in motion. My parents were 4 payments behind. The house was technically in pre-foreclosure. I called the lawyer Monday morning. We met that afternoon. It was quiet in the office, the kind of space where you didn't raise your voice because the walls were lined with real power, legal terms, deadlines, consequences. I signed the first set of documents calmly, methodically. The lawyer explained everything twice, but I didn't need clarification. I knew exactly what I was doing. By Wednesday, the sale was in escrow. I used personal savings, pulled from years of extra shifts, bonuses I never celebrated, and a small inheritance from my grandmother they'd never even asked about. I didn't tell Sorrel until the deal was nearly done. She looked at me, wide-eyed but steady. "Are you ready to break them?" "No," I said, folding the papers neatly into my bag. "I'm ready to stop letting them break me." She didn't flinch. Not when I said it. Not even when I stared her down in front of the nurse's station. "You've spent years speaking for me. I've just begun telling the truth." Claire's jaw clenched, but her eyes flickered with something close to panic. Just for a second. Then came the scoff, the dramatic sigh, the pivot into performance. Right on cue. She turned to the nurse beside us and muttered loud enough for the entire unit to hear. "Can you believe this? My sister's trying to ruin my life because I wrote a book. That's all this is." No one responded. Just the dull buzz of the overhead lights and the soft shuffle of shoes on tile. Even the heart monitor alarms in the room behind us seemed to pause. It had only been 2 days since I'd submitted the package. Journal entries, early drafts, emails, timestamps. I sent it anonymously, but there was no mistaking who it had come from. The publishing house replied to Claire's team within 24 hours. They weren't canceling the launch yet, but they were freezing all marketing efforts until questions of authorship could be fully investigated. Apparently, authenticity still mattered to someone. That morning, a large envelope arrived at our apartment, unmarked, no return address. Inside was a signed copy of Claire's new memoir, Resilience: My Journey. The cover was predictably overproduced, her face turned 3/4, gazing somewhere upward, like she'd personally solved systemic injustice. A soft blur around the edges. Her name printed large in serif font across the bottom. I cracked it open while Sorrel poured coffee. By the time she handed me a mug, I was already 3 chapters in and shaking. She glanced down at the book and asked, "Is this what I think it is?" I didn't answer. I kept reading. The playground bullying story? Mine. The summer we couldn't afford camp, so I worked at the library to save for textbooks, rewritten as Claire selling lemonade and learning about economics. The ER visit where Dad had a mild heart attack. That one was lifted word for word from an essay I wrote during my fellowship year, the same year Claire was living off my emergency fund, claiming she just needed a little breathing room. "She didn't even change the hospital name," Sorrel said, flipping to a dog-eared page. "She didn't have to," I said. "She knew no one would question it." When the local news aired her interview that night, it was like salt in a reopened wound. Claire sat across from a wide-eyed anchor in a set designed to look like a mid-century living room. She wore soft pink, her makeup perfect, her voice modulated and gentle. "I wrote this book because there are people like me out there," she said, eyes shining. Kids who grew up in houses that told them to stay quiet, who were told their dreams were too big. I was that child. I stood in our kitchen, watching the segment on Sorrel's iPad, my mouth pressed into a thin line. "She's still doing it," I muttered. "She's not even sweating," Sorrel added. "How does she keep a straight face?" I didn't respond. The next morning, I called a contact I hadn't spoken to in years, a woman I knew from residency who now worked in legal compliance for a publishing group in Minneapolis. I didn't ask her to intervene. I just asked her to take a look at the material and tell me if it raised a red flag. She called me back before lunch. "I can't say much officially," she said, "but yes, if that material checks out, there's a serious liability issue. They're going to delay the tour, probably pull first print run distribution, quietly if they can." I thanked her, closed my office door, and allowed myself one deep breath. But I knew Claire wouldn't go down quietly. And I was right. She showed up that Thursday at the hospital. She wore a navy blazer like armor and heels that clacked against the linoleum like accusations. I was finishing rounds when I saw her walk in, her posture stiff, jaw set, eyes scanning the room until they found me. "Vanessa!" she barked, loud enough to make two nurses stop in mid-chart. I didn't move. I let her come to me. "You need to stop this," she hissed once she was close. "You've made your point." "I haven't made anything. You wrote lies. People noticed. I shared my truth. You're just mad they liked it." I didn't raise my voice. "You repackaged my life, and now that someone's finally asking questions, you're playing the victim." "You don't get to call me that," she snapped. "You've always had a chip on your shoulder about being the boring one. You stayed in town. You worked in a clinic. You gave up. I didn't." I paused, then asked evenly, "Is that what you think this is about? That I envy you?" She didn't answer. She just stared, nostrils flaring. "You never wanted to be seen," she said finally. So I stepped up. "That's not stealing. That's filling a void." I tilted my head. "No, that's rewriting history to fit your needs." I turned and walked away. Sorrel met me in the break room 10 minutes later. She didn't ask what had happened. I must have looked calm, but she knew. She always did. "You okay?" she asked quietly. "Yeah," I said. "She just tried her last swing." "And?" "She missed." The day before the dinner, I was in my office finishing notes when I got the call from the conference coordinator in Chicago. She sounded apologetic. "We tried to confirm your attendance weeks ago," she said, "but we never heard back. We assumed you'd declined." "I never received the email," I said, spinning my chair toward the window, trying to keep my voice even. "That's strange. It was sent the same week your team registered the laptop. Does someone else use your device?" My stomach dropped. Claire had borrowed my laptop the week I was out of town. She said hers had crashed again, and she needed to finish a project. I didn't think twice. I handed it over. Of course she had redirected my emails. Of course. That night, I sat with Sorrel at the kitchen table, rereading the email she eventually helped recover. My invitation had been there, time-stamped, sitting in my junk folder the entire time. I could have spoken on a national stage. I could have connected with physicians and researchers and advocates who actually cared. But Claire had stolen more than my words. She'd stolen a door I didn't even know had opened for me. "I don't know what's worse," I said, setting my phone down. "That she did this, or that I wasn't even surprised." Sorrel reached across the table, resting her hand over mine. "You don't need to warn them again, Vanessa. You already did. Now, you show them." I nodded. Friday came quickly. I dressed carefully. Navy slacks, a soft white blouse, hair pulled back. Nothing flashy, just sharp. We arrived at my parents' house right before 6. The front porch light flickered like it always had. The walkway was still cracked, weeds curling out like little fists, and yet inside, everything was dressed up. The good china, the polished silverware, Mom's favorite candles glowing on the table like tiny spotlights. Claire was already there, seated at her usual spot, glass of wine in hand, the same smile she wore in her headshots plastered across her face. Mom hovered, adjusting napkins that didn't need fixing. Dad poured drinks. The conversation started light. Weather, someone's knee surgery, local politics. Sorrel and I exchanged glances. We both knew the script. Then, like clockwork, Claire leaned back in her chair, took a sip, and said, "Remember when they picked my college over your med school?" My father chuckled. "Good thing we bet on Clare," he said, with pride so thick it almost stuck in his throat. My mother gave a tight little smirk, eyes not even glancing in my direction. I sat still for a moment. Then I reached into my bag, pulled out a manila envelope, and placed it in the center of the table. Claire's smile wavered. Dad looked confused. "What's this?" I met his eyes calmly. "It's the deed to the house." He blinked. "I don't understand." "You refinanced it to cover Claire's tuition, then again for her condo, then again when she maxed out her cards. 3 months ago, the bank started foreclosure. You didn't notice, but I did." Mom dropped her fork. The sound was sharp, final. I bought the house, I continued. I own it now. For a long second, no one moved. No one breathed. You're joking, Claire said, eyes wide. You think I joke about saving the house you almost lost? Dad picked up the envelope with shaking fingers. He opened it, scanned the paperwork, his face drained of color. I didn't do this to shame you, I said. I did it because someone had to. But I won't carry this family anymore unless there are changes. Claire's voice was shrill. So what now? You want rent money? No. Mom and Dad can stay. They'll never owe me a dime. But you, Claire, you have 30 days to move out. Her mouth opened, then shut. For once, she had no script. I turned to my parents. There's a trust. It covers property taxes, maintenance, utilities, enough to live comfortably, but it doesn't cover Claire. Not anymore. Mom finally found her voice. Vanessa, she's your sister. She's been living off this house for years while calling it hers. That ends now. Claire stood up so fast her chair scraped the floor. You're a snake. This is about ego. You couldn't stand that they loved me more. No, I said, rising. I couldn't stand being erased. Sorrel placed a steadying hand on my back. You're kicking me out, Claire whispered. I'm holding you accountable, I said. It's not the same thing. She stormed out, her glass shattered in the sink on the way. My mother looked down at her plate. My father held the deed like it was a ghost. The room was quiet except for the candles flickering. Then Dad said, barely above a whisper, You were always the one who stood up. We just didn't see it. I didn't reply. I didn't need their apology. Just their silence, while I finally took my place at the table. The house was quiet again. Claire had packed her things, what little she hadn't already spread between 3 apartments, and left 2 days after the 30-day deadline. No dramatic exit, no apology, no hug goodbye. Just a thud of her suitcase against the doorframe and the sound of her car fading down the street. I didn't watch her leave. I was in the garden with Sorrel, trimming back the overgrown hydrangeas my mother never got around to tending anymore. I hadn't planned it that way. It just happened. But it felt right. A few days later, the phone rang while I was making tea. I glanced at the screen. Mom? Just that. No photo, no emoji. I let it ring once, twice. Then I answered. Hi, I said. Her voice was softer than usual, hesitant. Vanessa, I wasn't sure you'd pick up. I did. Silence. I'm not calling to talk about Claire, she continued quickly. I just wanted to see how you're doing. I didn't respond immediately. I stirred honey into my cup, the spoon clinking against porcelain. Eventually I said, I'm fine. Good, she said, but her voice cracked on the word. I've been thinking a lot since dinner. So have I. There was another pause, then, would you be willing to meet me? Just for coffee. Not at the house. Somewhere neutral. I agreed. 2 days later, we met at a small cafe halfway between my clinic and the old neighborhood. Sorrel came with me, not because I needed backup, but because I needed balance. She sat a few tables away, pretending to read, but keeping me within her reach. My mother looked smaller than I remembered. Her hair was pinned up neatly, but there were more grays than last time. Her eyes had a weariness I hadn't seen since I was a teenager. We ordered. She chose chamomile. I stuck with black coffee. When the drinks arrived, she didn't touch hers, just cupped the mug between her palms like it might offer her answers. I know I hurt you, she began. Not just at dinner. For a long time. I didn't nod. I didn't rush in to ease her guilt. I think, she continued, part of me always thought you didn't need as much. Claire. She was always so loud about what she wanted, about what she lacked. You were steady, responsible. I mistook that for not needing. I looked at her and said, Everyone needs something, Mom, even the quiet ones. She blinked and her lip quivered. We didn't believe in you the way we should have, she said. I see that now. I took a sip of coffee, watching her over the rim. You saw me. You just didn't listen. She nodded slowly, tears brimming. You're right. We didn't hug when we said goodbye. There wasn't a dramatic reconciliation. Just two women who had once misunderstood each other, now trying, maybe too late, to see one another clearly. Over the next few months, I visited the house. Not often, not alone. I'd bring Sorrel or a colleague from the clinic. I'd bring groceries, check the gutters, fix the light switch in the hallway. But I never stayed longer than needed. I didn't move back. That house didn't belong to the version of me I had become. But I kept it. Not for nostalgia. For legacy. One rainy afternoon in early spring, a letter arrived, handwritten, no return address. It was from Clare. The handwriting was unmistakable, sharp, slanted, rushed, just a single paragraph. You were always better. I hated you for it. I'm trying to stand on my own now. That's all. I read it 3 times, then folded it, placed it in a drawer. I didn't frame it. I didn't burn it. I let it be. Some days, I walked the lake trail behind our apartment with Sorrel. We'd sit on the bench near the willow tree, watching ducks scatter across the surface. One morning, I brought a journal with me, not one from the past, but a fresh one. New pages, no edits. I had been invited to speak at the same medical school that had once overlooked me. They were now using excerpts from my journals in a class on narrative medicine. I taught there once a week, not for status, but to guide students who, like me, had stories no one asked them to tell. I didn't share my story in full. Not yet. But I taught them how to hold space for the ones who had no voice, how to ask the second question, how to recognize quiet as strength. Sometimes I sat in the back of the classroom after the lecture, watching them pack their bags and file out into the world. And I'd think about that girl in 3rd grade with the solar system project no one praised. The teenager who folded up her med school acceptance letter without a word. The woman who finally stopped whispering. Some families break you, others make you. And sometimes, if you're very brave, you make yourself. Some families will never say they're sorry, but sometimes, silence speaks louder than any apology. Vanessa didn't need their approval in the end, just the space to finally stand without being overshadowed. Have you ever been the quiet one in your family? The one expected to survive without help? Share your story in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more true, emotional family stories that cut deep and stay with you.